Hello. Yes, today we'll talk about the Planck length. So, the Planck length is responsible for all form in this dimension. And the Planck length is at the very foundation of the work in regards to the machines that I'm attempting to build. So, I've thought of the Planck length for many years, and I've thought of its origins, and I've thought of why it is. And there's so much mystery, but there's some very, very simple ways to use the Planck length. And the machine, in fact, is a very simple expression of actually utilizing the Planck length. So the Planck length obviously is incredibly small, incredibly, it has a very, very small diameter. It's way below the atomic world in diameter. And think of the Planck length as the highest, as the resolution of this dimension, as in the pixel count. So each Planck length would be equivalent to a pixel, I guess, almost, of this dimension and the grid. And these pixels are, I guess, what render up reality in 3D, but it's such a high resolution pixel count. There must be so much freedom in between this space, scaled up objects, and the Planck length because of how small it is. To give you an idea of how small it is, and approximately 13 millimeters in diameter is over 100 octaves away from the Planck length. So it's the Planck length doubled over 100 times to scale it up to a visible diameter. And the reason I chose 13 millimeters approximately, there is a reason for that, which I'll explain in the video of octaves. So, yes, the Planck length being incredibly small is the foundation. And the machines are an expression of scaling the Planck length up. So the machines are quite simply taking that original value of the Planck length and literally pulling it like an elastic band far enough until it appears within the scope of what we can view, within a size relative to what we can actually physically, tangibly see, touch, and hold. So if I built a machine that was the size of the Planck length, it wouldn't be visible. There'd be no way to... So it's impractical. So to make it practical, you need to stretch it out. And how do you do this? How do you tell the grid or the matrix that that's what you're trying to do? And the answer is so dead simple. I don't think it could be anything else. And it is quite simply assigning a density to match the length. So everything in this theory has an equivalent. Every unit has its own equivalent. And you match those equivalents to get the potential, because you've actually just told the system, by physically assigning these values, you've told the system that all you've done is scaled up that fundamental unit to a specific size. And the units that are scaled are length, which is an analog for wavelength. The Planck length in the machine is equivalent to wavelength. So you assign wavelength using diameter. You also scale length using density. So the density inside the machine, scaled by using the vacuum and inert gases, matches the length that you've assigned using diameter. You also match those two values with angle. And this is where the geometry comes in. You match the correct angle with the correct wavelength with the correct density, and then fourth being frequency. So those are the four main values that the machine uses, the four main units: frequency, angle, length or wavelength, and density, which is mass inside volume. And all of those values are tuned to represent the same. They're tuned to be equivalent to each other. That's why the baseline units, there is only one value, so that you can actually know the same value for each one, and you can know how to match it when you scale it. So that's why I keep referring to those units as coordinates, because they are. You need to know one to be able to scale the other, to match the other. And then you can scale them all up. So, for example, as you scale the Planck length up, you might be scaling it using stress. It might be the diameter of a stress tensor inside the machine to create a stress region in space-time using the geometry. That, pulled right out, is assigned by the physical geometry of the machine. Then you match that by using the density inside the machine, by scaling the density inside the machine. And so that density is the equivalent to that length, and the frequency and the angle. There are other values and units that are used in the machine, but there are subsystems which are of less significance and complementary to setting up the system, such as force, magnetic force. But the four that I mentioned prior, angle, frequency, density, and wavelength, are the ones that really get the job done. That's the ones you use. Those are the ones you use to assign the system. So the Planck length and the universe is basically operating in the modality of a circle. The whole universe operates within a circle on the Planck scale and on a scale that is blown up from that scale, that is expanded. And the way to understand this visually, which is very close to the way it actually is think of a circle, the Planck length being the circumference of the circle, and it's vibrating at the Planck frequency, which the Planck frequency is the baseline speed of this universe divided by the Planck length. So it's an incredibly high frequency. 1 cycle a second, or 1 cycle per unit of Planck time, is 1 revolution around the circle. So the length is actually curved, and it's a closed system that curves around and ends where it begins, constantly going round and round and round and round. And through this modality, you can extract every other angle, and I'll show you how that's done in the video that explains the fundamental angles of this universe. You can use any angle conceivable as a modality of this circle that is oscillating at the Planck frequency. So this and it is like kind of like a string. So it's curved. It's not a straight line. The Planck length is not a straight line, but it has an analog to a straight line. It can be used in both modes, but it fundamentally operates as a circle. The universe is a circle, and everything is trapped within that circle. And for that reason, the circle can be used as the ultimate calculator to calculate angle, wave number, and wavelength. And I think this is miraculous. I'll show you how it's done in the coming videos, but the circle can calculate those three using one line traveling, and it creates these three values. So the circumference of the circle, being the Planck length, is all you need. Everything that happens within self-calculates, and that's what's crazy cool, because it's so solid and reliable to use that way to calculate things of this nature when it comes to angle, wavelength, and wave number relationship, which I'll explain in a later video. So think of the Planck length as the grid of this universe, the vibrating circular string, and also the fundamental building block of extracting different wavelengths and different modalities. Each machine is a pyramid shape, and just to make it clear, people become sticky in their neurons and think things like the Giza pyramid is the only angle that works as a pyramid. Absolutely incorrect. That's not true. It's just that people become infatuated with that system because it's one that exists and can be marveled over. However, there are infinite combinations and possibilities. There are many modalities in angle and wavelength, and interestingly enough, I'll have to make another video about this, but you can run machines off of systems that are not the Planck length. You can run them off the Schwarzschild radius inside planetary bodies and use that as the Planck unit, which the Giza pyramid does. It's not running off a universal system, it's running off a native system, which is using the Earth's singularity, the Schwarzschild radius of the planet Earth to boot up. So it's tuning into a native system, whereas all the systems that I focus on are non-native and universal. They can exist anywhere, in any time, in any space, and work because they're running off the one true grid and not a system based off of that system. So without becoming too complex in regards to that, essentially every planetary sphere has a singularity within that, and that has a specific diameter. If you're curious about it, look up the Schwarzschild radius to understand more of how that works. But that essentially can be exchanged for a Planck unit, and you can build systems based off of those radiuses and, well, diameter radius. You can create systems to run from the energy centers of the heavenly bodies, or planets, moons, and suns. So, and other things which I haven't even been able to come up with yet, but I'm sure there's many ways to do this. The maths just gets a little more complex each time we go down another layer. So I keep it really simple and referring to like the Planck length. the one beginning, the one universal beginning before the beginning. It's the beginning. So, what else to say in regards to the Planck length? Because it is the beginning and it is the one length, and it is the origin of all things in regards to, in the dimension of length, you can do anything with it. You can do absolutely anything with the Planck length if you understand how it works. And if you can relate angle to length, then you have those two. The marriage between those two is literally a ratio. It is one ratio, and I'll explain what that is in the future video of angle, wave number, and wavelength. But there is one ratio that literally fuses the two, and it's very, very simple. But before I forget, the slide on the screen that you see now is the correct way to calculate the Planck length using h instead of h bar in the equation, and the value that you see is the correct diameter, or the correct value for the Planck length. So that is wavelength, or just length. That can be wavelength of a wave, or just length. And so that's the beginning value. That can be seen also as in length, just distance, point A to point B in a straight line, or it can be understood as the circumference of a circle. So the Planck length being the circumference of the circle. So imagining the Planck length wrapped around a perfect circle, the end meets the beginning. And that's the secret. Using the circle is the secret of how you actually understand relationship between angle and the Planck length, or angle and length, because angle, like the other units, has an exact equivalent of length. And understanding those exact matching equivalents is the secret. And understanding that is understanding the reference points, and then you're able to understand how to command the matrix or simulation and tell it exactly what you're doing by assigning these values scaled up. So I think that's about all I'm going to cover at the moment in regards to the Planck length. There's so much that can be said about it, and it can go on forever. I'm not going to explain every single detail in regards to the nature of the Planck length, but it's just a vague kind of basic grasp on how we're using it to understand how to create form from length and how to assign angle to the length, so that you can understand how every pyramid angle is directly related to the Planck length, and how to calculate those using perfect integers and modalities, which I have a map which I've generated of all of the fundamental values, or all the fundamental modes, using perfect integer numbers starting with 1 to 1. Ratio of 1 to 1 is the Planck length, because it is 1 divided by 1. So that is a unison in music scale talk, music theory. That is unison, 1 to 1, and that is the beginning. And you can have every other modality extracted from that. But the higher the number, the higher the wave number, because the number is the wave number. And then the machines at a point can become impossible to build because the wave number is too high, or they become impractical. So there are only a certain a few modes that really work well. There's all sorts of problems that are encountered when designing these machines, or back engineering them, I should say, because they already do exist. They exist. They already do. So it's like finding a needle in a haystack, but when you start making headway, and if all of the values line up correctly, then, and it doesn't breach any of the laws, then you know that the machine will work in theory. So yes, it goes on and on and on and on, but without getting into all the sub details, and this is quite simply the fundamental unit, the length, the Planck length, the pixel count, this dimension, and its ability to be transformed into all physical form imaginable.